This is session 4, and this is your first lecture in session 4. This session covers chapters 4 through 7, and it looks at ethics and policing. First of all, the chapter, I'll be lecturing more from chapter 4 and chapter 6, but you'll still be required to read chapters 5 and 7, and questions on your exam will come from those chapters. But I think these two chapters set up the basis for ethical thought, and chapter 6 in particular, which will be our last lecture in this session, poses a lot of hypothetical situations for some ethical practice or ethical decision making in practice. But chapter 4 begins with an overview of the sources of ethical positions among police. It looks at 3 different types of ethical positions, if we kind of loosely call them types. First, it looks at both personal ethics and those of policing organizations or departmental ethics. This would fall under that collection of ethics we called applied ethical theory. And applied ethical theory looks at ethical values within organizations. So certainly the study of ethical values within police departments would fall under organizational ethics. Basically, the idea is that every organization has an ethical value system, and that they take ethical stances that pervade an entire organization. They also influence these ethical values. Organizational ethical values influence approach to ethical problems among most, if not all, of the members of that organization. Probably the best example in recent past or current example is that of Penn State and the football program. A lot is coming out in the news now about how that culture allowed for some dysfunction, not only among coaches but also among football players. There was a story I saw just today in the paper about a woman who was the head of student discipline, and how she confronted Paterno on many occasions in terms of student discipline or the discipline of football players. She met with a lot of resistance when it came to disciplining football players. So there was an ethical value system that pervaded Penn State and pervaded its decision making when it was confronted with ethical problems. Okay, the chapter also looks at ethics within subcultures. So we have personal ethics, organizational ethics, the organizations in which a police officer might work. But then it says there's also an ethical values that run through the subculture of policing. That even police across various organizations share some kind of cultural value. In terms of subcultural groups, the assumption is that there is something in common to the group, that a group shares particular values, shares particular value positions, and would come to the same ethical conclusions in a common way. If we contrast subcultures with larger cultures, we would say that subcultures exist within a culture at large. Let me give you an example. Say we have what's called American culture and American values. Some of those might be hard work, patriotism, maybe honesty. I mean, certainly the American dream, the idea that one can work and achieve success and achieve financial security, if not wealth, permeates American culture. Within that culture, we have public bureaucracies under which police departments fall. Public bureaucracies would be any of those organizations that are managed and funded by the state. By the state, I mean government, and it's a collective term for all forms of government, not the state of Texas or the state of Montana. So there are particular cultures within governmental agencies, and if you've worked for a governmental agency, you know that there are standards of behavior. There are ways in which paperwork and bureaucratic obligations are met. Just a lot of particular ideas that kind of permeate public bureaucracies. One that I remember from A&M is that as long as you kind of did your time, it was very, very difficult to fire a state employee. And so many of us kind of took it. I won't say took advantage of that, but we took some solace in the fact that we knew it was very difficult to fire someone at A&M. And in fact, people were not only not fired, firing someone usually amounted to promoting them and paying them more and giving them less responsibility. So you were kind of fired by promotion. I don't know if that's common of all public bureaucracies, but we would joke that that's a common attribute or a common occurrence at A&M. Policing organizations in particular within public bureaucracies, also we could say there's a subculture of policing organizations. So there's the culture at large, American culture, a subculture among public bureaucracies and individuals who work for public bureaucracies. Then we could say there's a subculture of policing. And the idea is that these subcultures share values, assumptions, and expectations of what the world should be, how people should act, how we should confront those actions. Now, if you take my my crime and pop culture course, we would talk about there how concepts of culture and subculture are a lot more complex. But for our purposes, again, this idea that they all share a particular worldview is important. So why is it important to study ethics in policing? Well, first of all, police officers have a unique role in society. They tend to be the only representatives of the state, again, meaning a governmental body, that individuals come into contact with. Maybe we come in contact with people who we pay our public utilities to, but for the most part, if we look at those who represent the authority of the state, they're police officers. I have, by coincidence, met the mayor of College Station once, but the previous mayor I never met. I don't even know who's on our public council or our city council. I know very little bit about city government, but I've met several police officers due to traffic tickets in College Station. So when I look at those that I've actually come into contact with from city government, they've more often than not been police officers. So if they're the only ones that the public comes in contact with, they have a special role in representing government, a special role in representing the body that has hired them. Law enforcement officers are also charged with protecting public safety through the enforcement of laws. That's a unique position as well. While some citizens, or there might be an instance where a citizen could detain someone, for the most part, citizens don't act the role of police. It's the police's obligation to enforce the law. We don't necessarily encourage individuals to do so. This is at the heart of the George Zimmerman case. Should an individual pursue someone that they think is involved in a crime, what's the role of the citizen? What's the role of the officer in that case? And that's part of that debate. Many would say, well, no, that was the enforcement of the law is the responsibility of law enforcement, not a citizen in protecting public safety. Law enforcement officers are also granted the ability to be coercive. If I were to be coercive with another individual, maybe apart from my children, that would be considered assault, particularly if it was physical coercion. If it's emotional or another type of conversion, that's brainwashing. Citizens aren't allowed to coerce other citizens into, or at least formally, into complying with your demands. But law enforcement is, again, a unique position. They can use force to coerce people into particular actions. They can even use deadly force if people present a threat, not only to the law enforcement officer, but potentially to public safety. So they have the special ability to be coercive in terms of the actions of the public. Okay, so where do the ethical positions of police come from? Your book outlines two general views on the sources of policing ethics. The first one argues that police come into the occupation with values and shared common values. The second one argues that values are learned not only before one becomes a police officer, but also during the course of becoming a police officer. So we have the value predisposition position and the values learned position. Okay, the value predisposition. Basically, again, police recruits come into the field with common values. I think this is true of any occupation. I would say there are occupational predispositions, that people who share interests and common values and a common sense of duty and work tend to gravitate towards the same occupations. Every now and then there'll be kind of a strange cog in a wheel, or some of us might make employment decisions based on opportunity and need, but for the most part, those who have a privilege to choose their occupation, they tend to gravitate towards occupations where people within that job already are like them and share similar ideas. So people self-select into policing, just like other occupations. I don't want to be a doctor. I have no tolerance for anything related to physically caring for other people. So I'm not going to self-select into that occupation. The same is true of policing. People self-select. They also bring with them their values, and those values often influence their choice. This idea that values are predisposed means those values exist, and those values actually influence the choice of the occupation. Okay, so the idea is that there are common values among police officers. Your book outlines some of these values. Now, you may agree or disagree. I'm not sure I necessarily appreciated how some of these ideas were framed, so I'm framing them a little bit differently. That's not to say that what your author says is not true, but I didn't particularly like the way in which they were portrayed. But I think there's a kernel of truth in some of the ideas. One of the first values that he talks about is the idea that police bring with them a conservative stance. Now, I wouldn't argue that it's a conservative stance like Republican or Democrat. The police are all Republican. I don't think that being conservative means you have allegiance to a particular particular political party. Being conservative, in its essence, means that you're less tolerant to change, or that you assume that change should come slowly, not quickly. Both people who are politically liberal and politically conservative can be conservative in their ideas about change. So I might be liberal on, I'm trying to think of a position, but I might be liberal on the idea of gay marriage, but I might think that we need a gradual approach, or we need a slow introduction of this idea into public policy. And that would be a conservative position. I might believe in equal rights for women, but it should be gradually implemented. Now, these are hypothetical examples I'm using, not necessarily my own. I'll give a caveat. These views don't represent those of the professor, I guess. So political systems in the United States and public bureaucracies in general are conservative by design. If we look at the Constitution, we look at the distribution of powers, we look at the charge that police agencies are given, we look at city governments and the process of deliberation, you'll see that governments aren't really meant to change very quickly in the United States. We've outlined a system of debate, we've outlined a system of cooperation. The democratic process, by its intention, is meant to be slow. It's meant to be methodical. Change is not meant to occur very quickly. So in its essence, we live in a conservative society. We don't make changes very quickly to major policies. So the idea is that police come into policing already conservative. He also argues that they come in valuing conformity, that the idea is that People should know the rules and expectations of a particular in their particular society, and they should follow them. Police officer values, if we said this just kind of normally, values the ability to play by the rules. And the expectation is that someone does play by the rules, that they conform to social expectations, and they do so willingly. Some argue that this is due to family structure, that police officers are more likely to come from families with traditional expectations, not necessarily traditional families with a mom and dad that with a mom that stays at home and they never divorce. That's not necessarily what I think the book is speaking to, but the idea that they have traditional expectations of parents and children and their role within society. He says they also might be influenced by military experience, and he cites a particular study that indicates that's probably true, that there is within policing a higher percentage of people who come with a military background into policing than in some other occupations. So, of course, in the military, conformity is not only expected, it's demanded. Okay. There's also an assumption that morality of moral absolutism, that there are universal, immutable truths and ideas and values, that there's very little black and white in the world, and that these truths can be applied regardless of the situation. He argues that people who go into policing have a very clear sense of what's right and what's wrong. They also see legitimacy in the law. They're not necessarily, according to the book, individuals who question the law or confront situations not necessarily as legal situations. The law has value, the law has authority, and it's meant to be defended. I kind of encountered this a lot in the drug use and abuse class because I come from a perspective on my experience in drug research was with health agencies. So I carried a kind of a health epidemiological perspective into that class. And I would often say, well, why do you think drug use is bad, or what's the problem with this drug issue? And someone would always say, well, it's against the law. And I have to kind of think again, oh yeah, there is a legal aspect to drug use. And it always kind of caught me off guard, but that's common to a law enforcement value system, that the law is there for a reason, and that we see things as breaches of law and as what's right and wrong and under the authority of the law. There is an instance, and I think this gets a lot of attention, or this group is considered anomalous because they do question the law, and they do advocate for changes in the law related to particularly marijuana. But the law enforcement, the organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP, is an exception where you do have a collection of police officers, police chiefs that do discuss the benefits of legalizing marijuana. Okay. They also value duty, and I would include into the book, they appreciate what power does with the function of power within a society. So the book argues that officers tend to share values related to public service, that they are drawn to occupations that are considered socially significant, that honor is valuable, service is valuable, and that they want to participate in a socially valuable occupation. I would argue that they also see that power is necessary, that public order is necessary, and power needs to be used to enforce public order, and that many would see that a power position is necessary to catch the bad guys or to confront crime. So power is an interesting value or characteristic. I think appreciation of power is an interesting characteristic among officers. I'd be interested to hear your all's opinion of how important the value of power is in policing in the virtual office, and feel free to comment on that and if my perception is right or wrong. Okay, there's also a values learned perspective. The idea being that values are learned over the course of a lifetime, that they're not necessarily a product of that policing values aren't produced by a disposition that they come to policing with, but that they're learned during the course of professional education. They're also learned prior, but that's not really the emphasis of this perspective. So the perspective would say, yes, social learning occurs in families, in media portrayals of police and other law enforcement personnel. Almost everyone in the crime and media class watches some kind of crime TV. So certainly there are ways in which the police are portrayed that are very right and very wrong in the media. But the values learned perspective really emphasizes the role of formal education, on-the-job training, informal job training, and then experience in learning values related to the policing occupation. Okay, and I'll try to go through this quickly so you don't spend a lot of time in lectures. They would say that in this instance we're using socialization and professionalization as terms interchangeably. Again, socialization being the process through one learns social rules and expectations. Child rearing is one of these areas in which it's all about socializing. You teach children to say please, you teach them to say excuse me when they burp. I mean, the whole thing is about learning the expectations and social rules that they'll confront later on in life. Students in school learn to raise their hands, and college students learn which professors are easy, which exams are going to be hard. You learn how to manipulate your time and select into particular classes. So we all learn what the social rules and expectations are. Professionalization is the process of learning job rules and expectations. And any of you who have either been employed or going through the employment process, you know that there is this learning curve that comes with every position. One of the first questions I asked, sounds kind of ridiculous maybe, that this was the first question I asked, but I had a friend who was at SAM when I first came on, and I asked him, well, how do the professors dress here? Do they dress more formally or do they dress informally? And at that time they dressed very formally. And so he said, well, you'll want, business casual. That's at least the minimum. And I said, well, how are professors, what do they want to be called? Well, it's strictly Dr. So-and-so and Dr. Longmire or Dr. Tackett Gibson. Now that's really different from other academic environments that I've been in. You call people by their first names, and people wear shorts and Birkenstocks to class. You can see probably in your classes that the expectations might be changing a little bit within CJ. But how you dress, how you reference others, what you can get away with and what you can't. There are all these informal rules in an occupation that we have to learn in order to be a good fit within that organization. Okay. The process begins with hiring. Basically, even an application teaches us what's valued for that position. To apply for an academic position at Sam Houston, you have to write a philosophy of teaching and a philosophy of research. So clearly the institution's interested in how you're going to teach and what your approach to students is. That's important. If I look at the application packet and they see that, I know, well, that's important. As police officers, they're screened. They're screened by several criteria. There's a writing exam. So just by knowing you're going to have to confront that, you know that writing is going to be a part of the job, and that they're concerned that you'll be able to communicate well. Medical and psychological exams show that there's a value to medical health, emotional and mental health. You also have physical tests. Those clearly communicate a value that police officers are physically fit, that part of the job requirement is that they remain physically fit. And then there's a drug screen. Police officers should abide by the law. Now, there are loopholes around all of these, but for the most part, an application articulates organizational values. There's also formal training through the police academy. So all recruits go through I'm not sure. I knew one student who was going through 3 weeks of police training at one police department. I've heard of others going through longer or shorter times, but there are formal training programs within most police departments. There's also a process, and I actually think this is more important than the formal training. There are informal training opportunities that continue during the formal training and then well past the formal training. Houston PD has a Run With Your Recruiter program. The conversations that occur during that run are probably far more important than any formal lecture you'll sit through. So those informal sessions, lunches with older officers or more experienced police officers, just informal talks that other officers might have with new recruits, all of those things communicate the values of the organization, and they help professionalize new recruits. The website, and I have in this slide the website to Houston PD's blog. Even websites help instruct people on what's important. If you go to that blog, you'll see really quickly what values are important to the Houston Police Department. When I looked at it, there's a photo honoring an officer that was killed in the line of duty. So clearly, respect for other officers, loyalty to other officers even in death, are some of those values that come through. That brotherhood, or a fraternity of police, we often call it, is one of the values that's articulated really just through that image. I'd be interested to see what your ideas about this blog is and what values you can identify just from this website. I'd be interested to see if you think they're similar or different from those cited in your book and from what we've talked about. But this blog is really interesting, and I think actually you can walk through the different articles and identify various values that the book addresses. It's really interesting, and not just the text, but the photography that's included on the website also speak to values. So I think that would be a really interesting exercise if you're interested in doing that. Okay. Some of the other areas of professionalization: informal on-the-job training, after formal training, after the police academy. When you're on the job, you often will experience, and this is again any occupation, coaching from other officers or coaching from other employees. A lot of times this is done as this is how it's really done. Yes, we say you do that by the book, but that's not really what we really do. These calls are the worst, so these are the ones that you can be slow to respond to. These are the types of calls that you know that to take seriously. How it's really done is an interest. This occurs even in academic professions. Oftentimes, students who take research methods, either at the undergraduate or graduate level, they have a very idealistic expectation of what data and research is, and the actuality is that research is really messy, and a lot of times assumptions are made or shortcuts have to be taken because of data limitations, or you're working with other agencies that just can't provide you with the information you need. So we would often, when I particularly worked at A&M, we would often instruct graduate students who worked with us, this isn't textbook. This isn't textbook research. You won't use you had an idealistic education and research methods, but this is how it's really done. On-the-job experience. This would be experience that the officer receives when actually performing the duties of the job. This would be confronting new challenges and situations, learning specifically just what to do, how to enforce the law, when to make an arrest, when not to make an arrest. Again, learning the limits of the job, what's okay and what's not okay, even if the situation is kind of outside the rules that you've been given. How do you act when you're on the job? Okay, professionalization, we would say, ultimately leads to conformity to subcultural values and behavior. Ultimately, people will say, what's in my best interest? And frequently that answer is, my best interest is to conform to the institution. It's interesting because there was a book written by a student that I knew at Northeastern University who he wrote a book on Harvard Law School graduates, and he interviewed them over the course of their law school education. It was about a 3-year project. And he looked at students who were coming into the law program, and then he tracked them and he interviewed them over the course until their graduation. And what he found was that most law students come into the profession or come into law school very idealistic, that they believe that the legal profession can help the world, it can bring about justice, that everyone deserves fair representation, that their ideas when they come into school are very different than the ideas when they come out. He says over the course of law school, their values change, and when they come out, they're interested in going into corporate law, they're interested in legal professions that earn more money than other professions, that their values have completely changed during that course of professionalization. So often they become social service versus what's in my best interest at the end. And then once individuals conform to those subcultural values, there tends to be a protection of those values. They're protected through tradition, again honoring this officer who was fallen. Particular events or services or yearly events that honor those who've died are traditions that are meant to honor those values of policing. They're also protected through loyalty. So loyalty to other individuals within the police department is also one of those things which protects those values. We keep them within our subgroup and we'll protect the particular positions that we take. There also tends to be, and this is in Chapter 7, there tends to be the use of neutralization techniques to also justify particular cultural values. This is why we hold these beliefs. Okay. I would organize this, and this is from the lecture, not from the book, a particular value shift as one is professionalized. Again, I think this is common to all occupations, but in particular, if we're to look at policing, we might see idealism, that recruits come into the occupation idealistic, and through screening, hiring, the initial stages of formal training, and the beginning of informal training, they remain idealistic. But like anyone who's on the job, there are instances where personal values are confronted with the values of the occupation, or even the limits of the occupation. This often leads to delusionment. This isn't what I expected it to be, and then cynicism. Well, this is kind of a joke. I'll stay in it, but I'm not really buying in to what's going on here. This occurs during, again, continued on-the-job informal training, and the conformity to subcultural expectations time within professionalization. And then eventually there comes an acceptance. This is who we are. This is what we do. The individual has at this point adopted those subcultural values. They've learned to justify those values and protect those values. They're also responsible at this point for transmitting those values. So they become the informal educators of new recruits. So I would say, again, idealism, disillusionment, cynicism, and acceptance are some of those maybe psychological phases that new recruits go through in terms of their professional education. Okay, what's next? Next, we're going to look at various aspects of policing influenced by ethical values. And then in the third lecture, we're going to look at some ethical scenarios.